Today's daf we're going to learn is Pesachim Lamed Chet. Today's daf is sponsored by Joanna Ram, marking the 23rd year outside of her father, Julius Ram, Zichrono Livracha, who was always a loving and supportive father to both his daughters and a strong role model for lifelong learning. I have no doubt he would have been supportive of our Daf Yomi adventure. And by Becky Goldstein, in memory of her father, a Holocaust survivor, Yoel Ben Meir, Zichrono Livracha, always my guiding light, who encouraged my unquestionable thirst for learning. He also imbued within me deep emunah and taught me Hashem can say no and still love us like parents. Yehi zichro baruch. Okay, we're going to start now. We have a relatively simple daf. We're going to start at the bottom with Rav Asi, at the bottom of Lamed Zayin Amabet. Amal Rav Asi. Isa shamaser sheni. Okay, let's do a little bit of review before we even continue. Maaser sheni. Remember we take the, right, first you have all your crops and you gather them and you put them in a pile and then you flatten the pile and then you're obligated in your trumot and maschot. So the first is trumah gedolah, which goes to the Kohen. You take 1 out of 50 approximately, right? You could do 1 out of 40, 1 out of 40 or 50 or 60, depending on whether you have, like, there's no exact amount, but let's say you have 100. So you take, let's say 2, 1 out of 50, 2 are separated. That's trumah gedolah. That goes to the Kohen. Then you take 1/10 of what's left. Okay, this is important because you're always taking it with what's left. The next measurements go by not what originally it was, but what's left. You take now 9.8 because you take 1/10 out of 98. You take that and you give it to the Levi. That's called Maaser Rishon. The Levi has to take 1/10 of that. We saw that the other day, Trumat Maaser. He has to take 1/10 of what he gets and gives that to the Kohen. Then you take from what's left another 1/10. Okay, so now you're down to a smaller, right? Each 1/10 is going to be smaller than the previous. You're now at 1/10 of that. What do you do with that 1/10? It depends what year you're in. If you're in, there's a Shemitah cycle of 7 years. If you're in years number 1, 2, 4, and 5, you take what's called Maaser Sheni. You take 1/10, you bring it to Jerusalem or redeem it onto a coin and bring the coin to Jerusalem and buy vegetables or fruits or produce, or you can even buy animals with that money, and you have to eat it in Jerusalem. That's Maaser Sheni. On the 3rd year and the 6th year, we give that same Maaser, not for yourself, but to poor people. Now, we talked the other day, okay, before we get to our sugya, on Lamed Vav. There was a machloket, if you remember, Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva, whether or not you can use Maaser Sheni for matzah. Whether you can make matzah out of Maaser Sheni. We had Rabbi Yossi Aglili who said no, because he said, oni, lechem oni, poor man's bread, doesn't mean poor man's bread, the way we would translate it. Oni, he says, switch the ayin with an aleph, and it's read as if it has a vav, and we're going to compare this to onen aninut, someone who is in onen with an aleph, which means someone in their family died. Since you can't eat matzah when you're in onen, you can't make matzah out of it, because matzah has to be eaten in a way that you could have eaten it if you were in onen. So therefore, he removes Maaser Sheni from being able to be used for matzah. The beginning of our sugya is not going to go according to him. We're going to be talking according to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says you can use it because Rabbi Akiva says, remember, oni, he learns not it's written without the vav. He says it really means ani, poor man's bread. Doesn't have anything to do with aninut, and therefore he thinks you can use Maaser Sheni. If you remember, we asked him, what about bikurim? He excludes because bikurim, he says, has to be eaten in Jerusalem. Well, so does Maaser Sheni. And to which he answered, Maaser Sheni, this is all important for today's daf, so keep this in your head. Maaser Sheni, remember he said, could be eaten outside Jerusalem. In the event that it became impure once it was in Jerusalem, you can redeem it and take it out, okay? Because then again, you would buy something new with that money and you'd be able to redeem it. Today we're going to learn that it sort of depends on the situation, but we'll get to that much later in today's daf. But the first thing they're dealing with is, according to Rabbi Akiva, who seems to think that you can, they're now going to raise that there might be a different issue. Okay, what's the issue? Amar Rav Asi. So first, we're going to talk about Maaser Sheni with regard to 3 different mitzvot. You can see it charted out on the first chart of the page. Isa shel Maaser Sheni. Okay, I don't want to continue before I say one more thing, which is a lot of intro to today. There's a big machloket, a very interesting machloket, Rabbi Meir and the rabbis, about the status of Maaser Sheni. What does this mean? Well, Maaser Sheni is a little bit weird because on the one hand, you have to bring it to Jerusalem, which sounds like, what else has to be in Jerusalem? What we call Kodshim Kalim, which are sacrificial meat that the owners can eat, or the meal offerings that the owners can eat, or whatever it might be that's sanctified, but the owners are allowed to eat, can be eaten in Jerusalem. That we generally call is not belonging to the owner. It's sanctified property. On the other hand, this is something that we say is, it's my food. Only I can eat it, right? It's mine. I bring it to Jerusalem and I eat it there. So it's this in between. Is it mine or is it sanctified? Is it God's, the way they call it? So there's a machloket, Rabbi Meir and the rabbis. Rabbi Meir says your maaser sheni, money or produce, is mamon gavoha. That means it belongs to God. That's why there's rules about it. Okay, it doesn't really mean it belongs to God. It means it's sanctified. It belongs to, whether you call it God, the temple, it's gavoha, right? That means high level. That means it's not mine. So if it's not mine, well, then there's going to be all sorts of ramifications. Halachically, if something doesn't belong to me, there's certain halachot that I can't do certain mitzvot or certain things if it doesn't belong to me. Or maybe in a certain case, we're going to see you're even exempt in a particular, right? We'll see. Some are stringencies, some are leniencies. The other thing is, so that's Rabbi Meir. The rabbis say, no, this is mamon hedyot. It's yours. It's true there's certain rules about it, but it's yours. Belongs to you 100%. It's not sanctified. It's just something you're supposed to bring and eat in Jerusalem, and it's yours. Okay, if it's yours, well, then all normal rules of things that are yours apply. So that's what we're going to say right now. Rav Asi is going to come and say that the machloket, Rabbi Meir and the rabbis, has all sorts of ramifications, and he's going to say in 3 areas of halacha, whether you hold that maaser sheni is mine or you hold it belongs to God. So, Isa shel maaser, again, I'm using the term belongs to God in a loose way. Right? Isa shel maaser sheni. Let's say I make a dough. Now, normally I make a dough of flour, of bread. I'm supposed to take challah. But if it's not mine and it belongs to God, then I don't need to take challah. So here you're going to have a big leniency. L'divrei Rabbi Meir, who says it's mamon gavoa, it's not yours. P'tulah min challah. You're exempt from challah. Okay, because we're going to see in the Torah it says reshit arisotechem, the first of your doughs, yours. It says in possessive form. So that means only if it's yours, not if it's not belonging to you. So this doesn't belong to you. You're not obligated in challah. L'divrei chachamim chayevet b'challah, but according to the rabbis, you're obligated in challah. Okay, that's halacha number 1. Halacha number 2, well, there'll be a difference whether you hold by Rabbi Meir or you hold like the rabbis. Matzot shel maaser sheni. What about matzah? L'divrei Rabbi Meir, ein adam yotzei b'yedei chavato b'Pesach. L'divrei chachamim yotzei b'yedei chavato b'Pesach. Here comes the stringency. You can't use this to be yotzei your mitzvah of matzah because it has to belong to you. Where we get this from, not so clear yet. Okay, whoever said matzah has to be yours, right? What does this remind you of? What mitzvah has to be yours that relates to holidays? Lulav and etrog, right? Arba'at haminim. You have to own them. We're going to see that in one more second. That's the famous one, that on the first day of Sukkot, you have to own, because the pasuk says, "Ulakachtem lachem bayom harishon." That's why it's the biggest reason why women should get their own lulav and etrog, because you're really supposed to be the owner of your own lulav and etrog on the first day. Okay, even though women are exempt from that mitzvah, but if you want to fulfill it, you may as well fulfill it in the proper manner and own it. What people do if they don't have their own is somebody gives it to them as a gift and says, this is yours. Okay, but it has to be given to you as a gift on the first day. Otherwise, you can't take a lulav and etrog that's not your own. And because it says bayom harishon, it's only in the first day, not the rest of the days of Sukkot. So this year was a good example where it wasn't important at all, because the first day of Sukkot came out on Shabbat, and therefore we don't bring lulav and etrog on Shabbat. So by the time you were obligated on lulav and etrog, it was ready for day number 2, where you don't have that obligation for it to be your own. So it was an easier year to share, which was convenient for people who wanted to save money during Corona. It was a good year to have that. But normally you're supposed to really own your own. Again, if you can't, someone can pass it on to you as a gift, but they have to pass it on to you as a gift because it has to be yours. So again, if it's mamon gavoa, right? So matzah, we don't really know where we get this from because it never says matzah has to be your own. Okay, we'll get to that later. Right? It's not like if you're sitting at someone's seder, they have to give you ownership of the matzah. Okay, we don't say that. So here it says, but still, if it belongs to gavoa, we're going to say that can't be. Okay, maybe it doesn't have to be exactly yours. And then the Mefarshim deal with where do we draw the line? In other words, and by the way, this leads to the very famous sugya of what if you have a stolen lulav? Can you use a stolen lulav? And it's called mitzvah haba ba'avera, right? You've done a mitzvah, but while you were doing it, you were doing something wrong at the same time. That's no good. But it's not even a stolen one. Even a borrowed one would be a problem. So the question is, do all those laws apply here? Since they're comparing it, that's a question that the Mefarshim grapple with. So also, it comes up in the Yerushalmi also, something about this. Okay, but moving on. So now we say, it depends whether you hold that it belongs to God or it belongs to you. If you hold it's just your own stuff, but you have to eat it in Jerusalem. So of course you can be Yotzei Matzah. Again, this would have to be according to Rabbi Akiva and not according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili. But what Rabbi Asi is saying, even according to Rabbi Akiva, who allows you to do it with Maser Sheni, theoretically, there's another problem is what he's saying. Okay, so it's a problem that, it's not your own, and that's a separate problem. So now we say the last one, etrog shamaser sheni. So again, he brings 3 halachot. 1, you're exempt from challah, according to Rabbi Meir. 2, you won't be able to use this for matzah. And 3, you can't use it for your etrog or for all the arba'at haminim, right? The etrog, the lulav, the aravot, and the hadassim. Etrog shamaser sheni, l'divrei Rabbi Meir. And adam yotzei bo yedei chavato b'yom tov. Yom tov, they mean Sukkot, on the first day of Sukkot. Because again, the rabbis view this as if it's your own, so it's totally fine. So matzke flour of Papa. Papa asked the following question: Bishlama Isa. Okay, I get Isa. Why you get it from Isa? Because it says Dichtiv arisotechem, and in fact, we're going to see this later. But the word arisotechem appears in 2 psukim, one right after the other. Okay, I'll read you all the verses because we're going to learn from all these verses in a minute. In Bamidbar Tevav, starting from the 19th pasuk, when you're eating from the bread of the land, soon we're going to darshan this word bread, okay, from the bread of the land, tarimu truma Hashem, give a portion to Hashem, which really means to the Kohanim. Reshit arisotechem, chalat tarimu truma, ketrumat goren, ken tarimu ota. From the first, I'm just reading the important parts, Reshit arisotechem, from the first of your doughs. The next pasuk says, "Mereshit arisotechem tidu l'Hashem truma l'dorotechem," which seems very repetitive, but here it says again, "Reshit arisotechem." Both times it says your dough. So the Gemara says, "I get Isa, dichtiv arisotechem, mishalachem." It has to be your own, and that's why, according to Rabbi Meir, this doesn't belong to you. You can't use here in this case, it's a leniency. You're not obligated in challah if it's from your maser sheni. So again, what happened? You brought wheat from home to Jerusalem, you turned it into flour, you made bread out of it, you're not obligated in challah, according to Rabbi Meir. Etrog nami, etrog I also get. Dichtiv ulakachtem lachem. Right? It says take for you, right? And then it goes through the list of the 4 things that you're supposed to take. Lachem mishalachem yehe, it should be yours. Ela matzah, but by matzah, miktiv matzatchem, does it ever say anywhere your matzah? No, it doesn't. So how do we explain that? Amar Rava, v'item Rav Yirmiyah bar Shlemya, either Rava or Rav Yirmiyah bar Shlemya said, Atya lechem lechem. Oh, it's a gzera shava from the word lechem that appears, that I pointed out to you just before, appears by challah. Also lechem oni appears by matzah. So ktiv hacha lechem oni uktiv hatam vayab achalchem milechem haaretz. Since the word lechem appears in both places, so we learned it out from Arisotechem that matzah also has to be your own. Again, big question, how far does we take this? Can you use borrowed matzah? Right, I saw a reference somewhere that if you buy matzah on credit in a store, and the store doesn't really want to give it to you on credit, you say, I'll pay you after Pesach, or I'll pay you next week after the Seder. And the store doesn't really want to do that, but you kind of push them into it. Could be you can't actually be Yotzei Matzah because it's not really fully yours. Okay, so that's like a good example. I mean, why you would be buying on credit if they wouldn't allow you to, would be another issue, right? Or a guest at a Seder would be another case about how far do we take this, right? A guest at a Seder, we all think that you can. So it's a matter of, it's not 100% that like the others, but it's somewhat like it. And then you'd have to say, exactly where. Okay, next. Even with challah, I don't think that you have to, if you borrow flour from your friend, you're also obligated if you make challah out of it. So I think they're all a little bit different from etrog, where it's really in a different category. So the question is really, are all the etrog laws equally applicable? How much do they apply to the other cases? So in this case, they seem to be really mainly excluding something that's hekdesh, right? Hekdesh is a different category. Okay, whereas here, it's, maybe for other things, not necessarily. Okay, now the Gemara says, Lema Mesayale. Oh, let's try to bring a proof. Okay, now lema again usually means we're going to bring something and reject it, or it just means it's a suggestion. So they're saying, let us suggest that this is the situation, that we can prove, let's suggest that we can prove what Rav Asi says from the following Braita. Because what Rav Asi's whole chiddush was, that Rabbi Meir and the rabbi's machloket about Maaser Sheni has ramifications halachically when it comes to challah, when it comes to matzah, and when it comes to etrog. So they say, oh, here's a good proof for what he's saying. Isa Maaser Sheni p'tura min hachala divrei Rabbi Meir. Chachamim omrim chayevet. The first halacha that Rav Asi said is explicitly stated in a Braita. It says exactly that. The Rabbi Meir says you're exempt from challah, from Maaser Sheni produce, right, a dough, and Chachamim say you're obligated in challah. That's exactly. So the Gemara questions this bringing of a proof that was worded as, let us suggest this is a proof. The Gemara says, Lema Mesaya Hainu Hach. It's exactly what he said. There's no difference between what the Braita said and what he said. It's exactly, don't say Lema Mesaya, say Misaya. Don't suggest it as if I'm not sure. So they say, no, Hachi Kamar, this is what he really meant to say. What he really was doing was asking a question. Is this a proof for Rav Asi and why? Should we say that since Rabbi Meir and the rabbis disagree when it comes to challah, because remember, he said 3 cases. This source only brings 1. Now, why would that one be different? We're going to see in a minute. So first he says, maybe it's a proof because maybe you can prove from challah that all the others, it will be the same. Maybe challah is different because it says arisotechem twice. So maybe one comes to say, if it's stolen or borrowed, no. And the second one comes to say that if it's gavoa, it's not, right? But maybe the others, which only have 1, or again, depends. One has 1 limitation, right? That's L'ulakachtem lachem by the etrog. And matzah we learn out from challah, but maybe we only learn it out from 1 reference and not from both. And therefore he's saying, I'm not sure that the same would apply to all the others. So that was his question, and we don't really have an answer for it. And again, Rav Asi gave the halacha. It's not like we have a question about the halacha. He was just trying to suggest maybe we could prove it from this Braita, maybe not. By Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, he now asks another question about Maaser Sheni. In this case, assuming you took challah from Maaser Sheni, this would be according to the rabbis who obligate you in challah. Right? Nowadays, we take the challah and we burn it. In those days, they would take a portion of the dough and they would give it to the Kohen. So if they give it to the Kohen, it's matzah. Can the Kohen be yotzei matzah? Or either they give him dough and the Kohen bakes it, or they give him baked dough of the challah and it's matzah. So can he, right, again, don't confuse the terms challah and matzah, right? It's not challah like we eat on Shabbat. It's the portion that we took out. That part, can the Kohen be yotzei his chiyuv of matzah with this? Okay, so now the Gemara immediately says, Aliba de Rabbi Yossi Aglili lo tibailach. Obviously, this question isn't according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Remember what he says? Maaser Sheni isn't, you can't be yotzei matzah from Maaser Sheni. So of course you can't be yotzei matzah from the challah taken from Maaser Sheni. So according to him, clearly not. And here they explain why. Hashta bechulin lo nafik. When it comes to chulin, you can't be yotzei. Bechalato mibaya, right? When it comes to before you took the challah, the regular Maaser Sheni, you can't be yotzei. They're calling regular Maaser Sheni chulin. Of course, when you take the challah, and the challah is more sanctified than the Maaser Sheni itself, because that challah, by the way, has status like truma. It's sanctified. If it becomes tamei, what do you have to do with it? Burn it, remember? So it's very sanctified. So of course that wouldn't be a question. Of course you can't use that for matzah. The whole question is according to Rabbi Akiva. Do we say, here are the 2 sides. This is why I started the class with this. Okay, I'll remind you. The whole reason why he says you're obligated and it's not excluded because of B'chol Moshvot, because remember, matzah has to be eaten anywhere you live, which should mean that it has to be eaten by items that can be eaten anywhere. Now, Maaser Sheni can only be eaten in Jerusalem. However, if it becomes tamei, impure, you can take it out of, you can redeem it and then take it out of Jerusalem. So maybe that's only with items. His whole exception is the reason why Maaser Sheni isn't an issue of B'chol Moshvot is because potentially you could take this out of Jerusalem. But you can't take challah out of Jerusalem. What happens if challah becomes tamei? You'd have to burn it. So again, let's read it. would you say bechulin hu denafik? Only if it's the chulin, the maser sheni itself. Because if it becomes impure, you can then eat it anywhere you want. But if it's challah and it becomes impure, you have to burn it. Can't be taken out. And therefore, lo nafik. Maybe you can't use this to fulfill your obligation of matzah. Oh, or potentially you could say, oh, Dilma Amrina, and this is Rish Lakish's question, the way the Gemara is explaining it right now, ho'il, because we'll see a second explanation of his question. This is the first one. The Gemara is going to say, oh no, maybe that's not his question. Ho'il v'ilu lo kara le'ashem. Okay, ho'il is going to be the important word. Ho'il means since. Okay, but it means, it's like a halachic concept, ho'il. Okay, we're going to explain what it means. Since ilu lo kara le'ashem, if you hadn't taken challah from this maser sheni and it became impure, what would happen? V'itame, eat laheter b'moshavot. You can take it out, you can redeem it again, and now eat these fruits anywhere. V'nafikba, and then you'd be able to use it for a matzah. If so, because, again, the fact that potentially, it's not that you have to have it become impure, redeem it, and then you could use it for matzah. No, the fact that if it was just maser sheni and you never took challah from it, it would be in the category of something that potentially could have been taken out. Therefore, hashtanami nafik. Maybe we would also fulfill our obligation in this case, because even though you now took truma from it, it came from something, right? Had you not taken truma, but they use the words here, lo kara le'ashem. Kara le'ashem is when I say, this is challah, right? You take your challah out, you make a bracha, that's calling it a name. You're calling it challah. But before that, it was just maser sheni. And it came from a place that theoretically could have been taken out of Jerusalem. So maybe you can be yotze with the challah. Maybe you can fulfill your obligation through that challah. So that's the question. But now, ikad amre, some people say, no, that wasn't his question. Because you would say like this, they start where this one ended. Ha vaday lo tibayla. Clearly that's not a question. Devadei amrinan hoil. We clearly say that since the challah came from the maser sheni, and the maser sheni, and if we want to say hoil works. You can say, since it came from something that theoretically could have been taken out of Jerusalem, therefore we're going to call this also something that could theoretically have been eaten anywhere. That's not the question. Ki tibayalach challah halakuach bekesef maser sheni. Okay, now before we then move on to the end of the sentence, we have to explain something. Until now, we've talked about I have my produce, I bring it to Jerusalem, or I redeem it on a coin. There's two possibilities. We're now going to learn that when you eat this food in Jerusalem, there's a difference between if it's the produce I brought with me or the produce that I bought with the money that I redeemed my fruits onto and now bought something with it in Jerusalem. What's the difference? The difference is so what they're saying is, what if it's challah that I bought with the money of maser sheni? In other words, it's not what I brought from my house. Okay, now if I bring it from my house, I haven't yet redeemed anything. So if something were to happen to it in Jerusalem and it became impure, I'd be able to redeem it and take it out. Okay, that's the halacha we learned before. We're now going to learn. It's not clear if that would apply to items that you bought in Jerusalem with your maser sheni money. It might only apply because how many times can you redeem the same thing? Can you keep redeeming and redeeming? So there's a machloket about this. One opinion says that whatever I bring from my house to Jerusalem, if it becomes impure, I can redeem it in Jerusalem. But if I already did the redeeming at home, and now I bring the money and I buy something in Jerusalem, I can't redeem that, okay? Some people say, no, it's all the same. In other words, if I buy it with my maser sheni money and in Jerusalem and something happens to it, I can redeem it. There's a machloket. So what's the machloket? The machloket is, what do I do with produce that I bought in Jerusalem with my maser sheni money that became impure? According to Tanakama, I can redeem it. According to Rabbi Yehuda, I have to bury it because it's a classic case of kodshim, right? Or something, and it's maser sheni money. It's not exactly kodesh. Again, that's part of the debate. But what he says is, since I already redeemed it once, I can't redeem it again. So all I could do is bury it, okay? Because it's impure now. So let's read inside. So now the question becomes, ki tibayalach, the question is about challah that was bought with kesef and maser sheni. V'aliba de Rabbanan lo tibayalach. Now the question is not according to the rabbi's opinion. Why? Because I already told you. Kevan de amre yipadeh, since he says you can redeem that also, hainu maaser. That's maaser. In other words, again, we're not talking about challah here. We're talking about maser sheni itself. since he says the Maser Sheni itself could be redeemed, so we say, even though the challah itself can't be redeemed because that's sanctified and I have to burn it, but since it comes from Maser Sheni that I could have redeemed, I can redeem it, meaning it could have potentially been redeemed, meaning it's considered b'chol ha'moshavot. I can use that for matzah. But, and now they're going to say, right, ki tibayelach, the question is according to Rabbi Yehuda Damar Yikavel. Rabbi Yehuda says, if I bought it in Jerusalem with the money that I brought from home, that I cannot take out of Jerusalem under any circumstances. The question is going to be according to him. So if it became impure, the only thing I'd be allowed to do is bury it. Ditnan. So first we're going to bring the machloket. It says in the Mishnah, halakoach b'maser sheni shenitma yipadeh. If I bought it with the money from maser sheni and it became impure, Tanakama says yipadeh, I can redeem that. Rabbi Yehuda Omer yikaver. That's what I already told you before. Now the Gemara is just showing it to you inside. It's a Mishnah, and Rabbi Yehuda says it has to be buried. So now come the two sides of the question according to Rabbi Yehuda. Now the question is, how far do we use ho'il? Can we say, mi amrinan ho'il v'i lo lakuach have v'ho'il v'lo kara al shem, can we do a double ho'il? Can we say, theoretically, since this could have been the produce I brought from home, and I would have been able to redeem it. And even though this is challah and I can't redeem it, but this came from Maser Sheni that could have been brought from Maser Sheni from home, that could have been redeemed. Can I say it twice? V'itame yesh lo heter b'moshavot v'nafik bey. And therefore, right, since if that original one, even though I'm 2 steps removed, could have been redeemed if I brought it from home myself, and if I hadn't taken challah from it, I would have been able to redeem it. In other words, again, this is the challah itself. Obviously, what's left could be redeemed itself. In other words, not the Maser Sheni part, just the challah. But before I had taken challah, I could have redeemed it. Therefore, hashanami nafik bey. Therefore, here also I can fulfill my obligation. Or maybe we only say ho'el once. You can't use ho'el twice. It's already twice removed. That's too weak. Okay. The question is an interesting question about how strong is a ho'el argument. Can it survive 2 removals or not? So Amarava mistabra shem maaser chadhu. So Rava answers the question and says, maaser is maaser. It's all called the same thing. It doesn't matter whether this one was the one you bought in Jerusalem and Rabbi Yehuda says you have to bury it. It doesn't make a difference. It's still maaser sheni. It's challah that came from maaser sheni. Maaser sheni can be used for matzah because it could be eaten anywhere. Therefore, the challah can also be used as matzah and because it can be eaten anywhere. Okay, so that's our answer. So again, let's just go through our structure for today. So far, we have Rav Asi who brought 3 halachot about the ramifications, halachic ramifications, about the machloket Rabbi Meir and Chachamim about whether Maser Sheni is considered mamon gavoa or mamon hedyot. Does it belong to God or the temple versus belonging to you personally? Then, right, we tried to say, how did we get these 3 halachot, right? We learned out matzah from challah because it says lechem in both places and therefore it has to be your own, right? That's why Rabbi Meir, who doesn't view this as your own, wouldn't think that you can fulfill your obligation. Then we brought this question of Rish Lakish. Can you be Yotze, not with Maser Sheni, but with the challah taken from Maser Sheni? Can a Kohen eat that as his matzah? Obviously, the question is only according to Rabbi Akiva, not according to Rabbi Yosef, who doesn't even allow Maser Sheni. And then the question becomes, number one, what exactly is his question, right? Does it have to do with, do we say ho'il or not? Or can we even say a double ho'il? Is that the question? Can we go that far or only one ho'il? Now we're moving on to the other part in our Mishnah. Our Mishnah, at the end of our Mishnah, talked about chalat, todah, rikikei matzot. Remember, these are the matzah type breads that they made with the sacrifice, with the todah, the thanks offering, and with the nazir. Right? The nazir brought 20. The lachmei todah, the thanks offering, comes with 40 loaves. Again, 10 are real chametz. The other 30 are not. So he says, if you remember in the Mishnah, it said it depends what you do with it. If you made it for a sacrifice, then you absolutely can't use this for matzah. If you made it to sell in the shuk, you could. So later, we're going to get to the second part about selling it in the shuk. First, we're going to try to understand what's the source for the fact that if I made it for a sacrifice, I can't use it. Amal Rabba, we're going to have, it's also very simple structure, 2 different verses to prove it from. And then we're going to bring a braita to prove each opinion. Okay, a braita that matches 100% to what each of them said. So it's going to be Rabbi and Rav Yosef and Moraim, and then we'll bring Braito to prove their proofs. Ushmartem et hamatzot. It says in the pasuk Damar Kra. The pasuk says Ushmartem et hamatzot. You have to protect the matzah. So what does it mean to protect? Matzah mishtameret l'shem matzah. This teaches you that there's a mitzvah of, well, let's say I'll tell you the most famous, the halacha where you have lishma, it has to be done in that person's name or for the sake of that person. Get, for example, a get has to be written for this person. If a person has 2 wives with the same name, okay, I know this isn't the most practical example, not nowadays, not even in those days, even if you had 2 wives, likely they didn't have the same name. If you end up with 2 wives with the same name and you write a get to divorce one of them, and then you change your mind and decide to divorce the other, that's no good. It has to be written with her in mind. Okay, or the famous examples they talk about in the Gemara, you find a get in the garbage, which, with your name and her name, and, the man's name, the wife's name, and then he pulls it out of the garbage and says, oh, I'm going to use this. Okay, so that needs lishma. We're going to see matzah lishma is going to be a little bit different than that, but it also seems to have a certain element, according to Rabbah, of having to be lishma. It has to be made for the sake of matzah. This was made not for the purposes of matzah. This was made for the purposes of a sacrifice. So therefore, it doesn't work. Rav Yosef Amalka. Okay, now by the way, I just want to point out, this is relating to the preparation of the matzah, whereas the next answer is going to be related to the eating of the matzah, okay, or the final stage of it. Okay, it's very interesting that one's focusing on the before and one's focusing on the after. So Rav Yosef Amar Amalka, the pasuk says, Shiv'at yamim matzot tochelu, eat matzah for 7 days. What do they learn from this? It has to be matzah hane'echelet l'shivat yamim. It has to be matzah that potentially could be eaten all 7 days. So what's the difference here? Remember, we talked about sacrifices, notar, right? That the sacrificial items have to be eaten within a time frame. The korban todah in particular, and the nazir also, had that day and that night to eat them, not just the meat, also everything that went with it. So these breads had to be eaten by that night, which means that this couldn't be potentially eaten for 7 days, and therefore it can't be used for matzah. Matzah has to be something that potentially could be used for the long term. So therefore, so again, one's talking about the prep, right? How it's made in the wrong way. One is talking about what its end time is, right? This has an expiration date, so to speak. That can't be, you can't use that for matzah, even for the first night, even if you could potentially eat it that night, right? It's something that has an expiration date on it. That doesn't work. Tanya kavatei de Rabba, v'Tanya kavatei de Rabbi Yosef. As I said, we're going to bring a braita to prove each one. Tanya kavatei de Rabba, presumably Rabba didn't see this braita, and then someone said, oh, by the way, there's a braita that says exactly this. And both have the same structure, which is in the form of question, answer, and answer coming from a pasuk. You might have thought that you could fulfill your obligation for matzah with the chalot of the todah, or the todah, the rikikim of the nazir. Talmud lomar ushmartem et hamatzot. Therefore, it says you should watch the matzah. From here, we learn has to be done with the right intent. Matzah mishameret l'shem matzah. Yatztazo she'ena mishameret l'shem matzah ela l'shum zevach. Right. This was made for a different purpose, not the purpose of the matzah. Right. It was made for the purpose of a sacrifice. It's almost like, as opposed to something that was, let's say, made for no purpose at all, right? They're saying this is made for something else. You had something else in mind, and that's going to be a problem. Tanya kavatei de Rav Yosef, Yachol yatsa adam yedei chavato b'chalot todah rikikei nazir. Talmud lomar shivat yamim matzot tochelu. Matzah ne'echelet l'shiva, yatzdazo she'ena ne'echelet l'shiva ela liyom v'layla. Okay, it's exactly word for word. I'm not going to explain it again because we just said it, but basically it has to be something that could be eaten all 7 days, and this can't. So now they ask, okay, now they're going to ask, the next section is 3 other possibilities where they could have learned this from. And why did you learn from that verse or that verse? We have 3 other good potential proofs that you could have used to prove your halacha. That, again, that you can't use matzah that was made for the loaves that go with the nazir sacrifice or with the todah, the thanks offering. So first one. Each one we're going to bring and then reject. V'tepukle milechem oni. Mishenechal ba'aninut. Yatzazeh she'no nechal ba'aninut ela b'simcha. This should sound familiar to you. This is what Rabbi Yossi Aglili said. Why don't we say like Rabbi Yossi Aglili said about Maser Sheni? Oni, which means poor man's bread. He darshans as oni with an aleph, as onain, meaning only things that you can eat when you're an onain, which would exclude Maser Sheni, which can't be when you're an onain, and also our issue, the chalot of the nazir and the rikikim of the rikikim of the nazir and the chalot of the of the Toda, which by the way, we talked about this in the Mishnah. It could be, they both have Rikikim and Chalot, okay? So it could be either, but in any case, those can't be eaten when you're an Onin. You can't eat anything from a sacrifice when you're an Onin. So therefore, why don't you exclude that for that reason? So the Gemara answers very obviously, Sabalak Rabbi Akiva, Damar Aniktiv. Remember Rabbi Akiva said, I don't darshan that drasha. So they say whoever darshan, right, Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef must be agreeing with Rabbi Akiva, and they don't darshan that because it doesn't say, right, it wasn't really the aleph and the ayin that bothered them that they switched letters, but the fact that it's written without a vav, and therefore it could be read as ani, a poor person, and not oni, the way they tried to say that oni means aninut. Okay, so now they say, okay, second answer. What did we learn about matzah? Matzah has to be just flour and water. Now these rikikim and chalot weren't made of only matzah, only flour and water. They had oil in them also. So they're going to ask, how could you even have thought that this would work? It's not lechemoni, it's not poor man's bread, it's rich man's bread. We already learned, right? Even if maybe you could use it on Pesach, you definitely can't use it to fulfill your obligation of matzah the night of the Seder. So the answer is going to be, it's an interesting answer, because we would have thought any oil is a problem, right? You add any kind of amount of this, it would be an issue. Amar Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, revi'it hi, u'mitchaleket hi lekama chalot. Okay, I'm not going to go into all the amounts and all this. We're going to get to this much later on. We learned about these inside, but there's a whole calculation they do of exactly how much oil they put for how much flour. Okay, it comes out to, Shansin has a note, it's 1 out of 192 is the ratio between oil to flour in some of these. They actually split in the Lachmei Todah. There's the 30 that are matzah-like. There's a quarter of a loaf goes to 10 of them, and a quarter of a loaf goes to the other 20, and then it gets split into all those 10 loaves. By the way, the loaves are huge, okay? When I went to that bakery, Seidel's Bakery, it's an amazing, he's now doing it online, by the way, so if people want to look it up, it's really recommended. Gives you a whole insight into what it's like to do the, what they look like, how it worked. They were huge, 40 huge loaves. We're not talking about small loaves of bread. They were large. So a quarter of a loaf, which is it's between 345 to 600 milliliters, not a volume. It's not a lot. So that amount for the huge amount of flour that they use for all this is very minuscule. That would not call it, which is very interesting. It would not be called matzah shira. This maybe goes also to dinei bitul. Like it's so insignificant that it doesn't consider it matzah shira. Okay, and I could tell you, we tasted them after. They definitely don't taste, the basic ones don't taste very oily. You don't taste that. It's not like some other breads that have a lot of oil in them that's noticeable. Okay, so now, unfortunately, if you do the workshop online, you don't get the whole sense to be able to taste it. It's not the same. Okay, so now that was our second option. Why don't we say it's matzah shira? So we say, oh, there's so little oil in there that it's not considered matzah shira. Last answer, the question, wait a minute. These are kochim kalim. They have to be eaten in Jerusalem. Remember, kochim are things that are entirely belong to God. Kochim kalim are things that are parts of sacrifices that the owners eat in Jerusalem. So that is only eaten in Jerusalem. You can't eat these outside Jerusalem. So that would be, we've already said, has to be matzah that can be eaten anywhere. So Amarish Lakish, Zot Omeret, Chalot Todah Rikikei Nazir Nechalim B'Nova Giv'on. Brings a historical answer. It's very interesting. Nova Giv'on were places where the Mizbeach, they have the Mizbeach that they took with them all the time from the original Mishkan. And that Mizbeach was in Nova Giv'on at certain times of history. Okay, so particularly after Shiloh was no longer, and these places had the Mizbeach, they didn't necessarily have the Aron with them. Okay, it didn't have the same status of the Mishkan. And it was a place, in those days, you could also sacrifice certain things outside on a small altar that you did on your own. Certain things could only be on the big altar, but you weren't limited. There was no space. There was no mishkan. So you weren't limited. You could eat it anywhere, because once there's no space around it, well, then it's not like it's limited to this particular space. You could have eaten it anywhere, right? It's a little bit tricky, the wording here, because it sounds like it could have been eaten in Nova Givon and not in Jerusalem, but really it could have been eaten anywhere. It means when the altar was in Nova Givon, the big altar, then you were allowed to actually eat these anywhere. So at some point in history, right, this is like the Hoyel argument, but a bit of a different argument. There, it's since this exact item could potentially, before you take the challah, could have been eaten. This is saying since at some point in history, it didn't only have to be eaten in Jerusalem, therefore also now it doesn't have to be eaten only in Jerusalem. Therefore we could treat it as it's not part of something that's only eaten in Jerusalem, since at some point in history, it could have been eaten outside. Okay, last part for today, Tanya. What we didn't deal with yet is the difference between if I made it for my own sacrifice or someone's sacrifice, or I made it to sell in the shuk to someone who's going to buy it for their sacrifice. Then if nobody buys it, I can use it for matzah. So didn't we say already, ushmartem matzot has to be lishma. So how could this be? So we're now going to have a braita, and it seems that this braita didn't know of our Mishnah. Okay, at least Rabbi Eli didn't know. You're going to see. Amar Rabbi Eli, sha'alti et Rabbi Eliezer. I asked Rabbi Eliezer the following question: Ma'u sheyetzeh adam b'chalot todah rikikei nazir? Can you be yotze? Right? He obviously didn't have our Mishnah. Then our Mishnah says it explicitly. Amar li lo shamati. Even Rabbi Eliezer didn't know. He says, I don't know. I didn't learn this. But right, lo shamati always means I didn't learn it from my rabbis. I don't have a tradition about it. It wasn't necessarily the most practical question. Right? It doesn't come up all the time that this is what you want to use for your matzah. So it seems reasonable he wouldn't have necessarily known. Mati v'shalti l'fnei Rabbi Yoshua. So Rabbi Eli goes to ask the next rabbi, Rabbi Yoshua. Amar li harei amru. He says, oh, it was said, he knew. Chalot todah rikikei nazir sha'asan la'atzmo ein adam yotzei bahem. Limkor b'shuk yotzei bahem. He tells him exactly what it says in our Mishnah. It depends what you plan to do with it. So then Rabbi Eli goes back and reports back to Rabbi Eliezer. And kishabati v'ertzeti dvarim l'fnei Rabbi Eliezer amar li brit hein. Okay, we're now going to have two versions, and this is all the problem without having punctuation and what do you call them? Can't think, but like question marks, exclamation points. We don't know how to read this line. He told him, brit, I swear. This must have been passed down directly to Moshe in Sinai. Okay, which sounds like he's saying, wow, that's a good answer. Now it's strange he's saying this because if it was so much passed down from Moshe from Sinai, why did he not know about this? Which maybe is why they think the second explanation maybe is more believable. Some people say, Brit, what, you think this is just told from Moshe b'Sinai, v'lo tama b'ai, and you don't need a reason? In other words, what's the logic here? So the Gemara then says, v'tama mai, right? So either he liked his answer or he didn't really like his answer and said, that's not sufficient. I need an explanation. So now the Gemara tells you what's really the reason behind it. Amar Rabba, kol lashuk im luchei mimlach. Anything you sell in the shuk, at the start, you might sell it, you might not, right? Nobody knows what's going to happen. And then therefore, Amal, mizdabin, v'lo mizdabin epuk bu'ana. When you made it in the first place, you said, if I sell it in the shuk, that's great. If not, I'll eat it myself for my chiyuv matzah. And that's why it was lishma. Now, this is why lishma is a little bit different, but potentially you had in mind when you made it that it might be your matzah. And I think I always use this example of my daughter and her baking business. So she has this baking business. And so it's like, right, if I don't sell it, well, we'll get to eat it in the house, right? So, which some people think is good, some people think isn't good. But the idea being that she knows when she bakes it, that if no one's going to buy it, right, it might end up being eaten in the house. You have another use for it. So therefore, in the beginning already, they were thinking about eating it as matzah. And we're going to end with that for today. Have a great day, everyone.